Good afternoon. Okay, one more time. Good afternoon. Sounds better. How many of you have been here since last night? And how many of you are loving the conference? That's good. That's good. So this specific panel is called Criminalizing Webs. And what we're going to do is talk some about what three specific strands that are happening nationally and globally, how it impacts Black women and girls, other women of color and girls of color, trans people of color, and gender nonconforming people of color. And also talk about what the approaches to addressing those strands of criminalization are. And before we start, I just want to say a little bit about what the format's going to be so you have a sense of what to predict. We're going to start, I'll do some opening and framing for this panel. We're going to hear from amazing panelists who I will introduce. I'll ask them a few questions so that it's not just going to be talk. And then we're going to open up for some conversation, ideally not only to get questions from the audience, but also to hear some of your ideas and what you're already doing that really starts to actually address what's been discussed so far this weekend. So that sounds okay? Okay. If anybody said no, I don't really know what to do about that. So thanks for being so willing. So let me just start by saying that I want to just really thank Andrea and Barnard for pulling this conference together. It's something that we all need, and my guess is that all of us are learning from it. Secondly, of course, thanking all of you for being here, and then I want to turn a little bit to some of the context. So there's four strands that we're going to be talking about, right? War on drugs, war on terror, war on immigrants, and also broken windows and other kinds of abusive and discriminatory policing. But before we talk about that, I feel like it's important for us to just set out a little bit of context. And anything that you like that I say, you should attribute to Communities United for Police Reform. Anything that you just think is wretched, attribute to me. I will take responsibility. Talk to me afterwards. But the first thing that I just want to say is that even though we're talking about kind of these four threads of a web, there's a context of many other threads, right? So we've also got, in terms of criminalization, we've got the school to prison pipeline, we've got surveillance of Muslim communities, Black communities, protesters, everybody actually is what's growing in terms of regular surveillance. We have the hyper-militarization of law enforcement, as well as hyper-militarization of our borders. We've got the gutting, really, of access to public services and goods, which includes everything from social services and the providers of social services actually being turned into police. So when we talk about policing, we're not only talking about, in New York City, the NYPD. We're talking about the doctors and therapists who are mandated and sometimes comply to report on their patients. We're talking about school guidance counselors. We're talking about therapists and others who are then actually acting oftentimes, too often, as snitches and informants for the state. In addition, we're talking about gutting public services in ways where, how many of us remember that actually and know that residents in Flint still don't have water, clean water, and it's 3 years later. So when we're talking about criminalization, I'm actually going to bring in what the context is that's broader than just what we see as police, but really what the overall social context is that we're operating in. The second thing I think that's important for context is to place this in a global context. We're in New York City, we're in the United States, but the way in which criminalization operates and these criminalizing webs is we can't understand it without understanding global capitalism and understanding that really there's been a history and a present day of accumulation of wealth by global capitalists that's based on not only the genocide of indigenous peoples, not only the enslavement of African descent peoples, not only the experimentation and sterilization of women of color, we also have really the indentured service, but also kidnapping of Black and other people of color who have built the railroads, who continue to care for children. We have an entire system that's based on actually global capitalism. And then we also, right now, continue to have militarization outside of these borders, many times that the US is still employing imperialism. So whether we're talking about military bases in South Korea or the Philippines, whether or not we're talking about the disaster right now in the US Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, that we are not actually, this country's government has not actually assisted at the level that we can and should morally, or whether or not we're talking about really what the gutting of public services over the past several decades in the United States has meant for many of our communities. That's the context when we talk about criminalization. There's no way to separate those two things. And now, the last thing I'll say before going into some of the policing piece is to say that we're November 4th, 2017. We're about 11 months into what we would call, or some of us call, the Trumpocalypse. It's only 11 months. This has been an incredibly speedy, comprehensive attack on all fronts of our communities throughout the country, but also globally. And in this moment, part of what we have to understand, I think, in this conversation around criminalizing webs is that this is speedier and more destructive in the past 11 months than the entire reign of Reagan, the entire reign of Bush in some ways. However, it would be wrong of us to think that all we need to do is to resist Trump. That in the moment that we're in right now, the Democrats will not save us. It actually doesn't matter who the next president is if we have not organized our communities and have not built up power. And so this panel, in many ways, I'm excited to have folks speaking on various areas because they're going to talk about what it means, what the destruction is in our communities in some ways, but also what it's going to mean to build power. I'm going to switch gears to, so I was not supposed to be the moderator originally for this panel, so I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about the thing I would have talked about, if that's okay, which is really around policing. And policing in this part, I'm not going to talk about the global rhetoric of policing. I'm going to talk about New York City policing. How many of you are from New York City? Okay. So one of the things in terms of New York City is that in some ways we're really known as the birthplace of something called broken windows policing. Back in the 90s, we had this wretched mayor. His name was Mayor Rudolph Giuliani. Some of you remember him. He really popularized, along with a wretched commissioner, his name is William Bratton, popularized this concept that these social scientists wrote up in a magazine. It was like a 10-page article in a freaking magazine. So it's not a theory of policing, but it is now called a theory of policing. And that magazine article was called something about broken windows. And the theory behind it was really that that the role of police needed to be more quote-unquote proactive. And that role needed to be not only things like solving crimes and murders and that sort of thing, but really maintaining order. And that the idea was that if you have an area or a block or a neighborhood where all the windows are broken in a house, people will feel less safe. Now, what that actually tells me, if we just stop there, is that in order to maintain safety, we have to invest in public infrastructure and housing and education and healthcare and jobs. But that's not the direction they took. What they said was that those broken windows are actually, they decided that groups of people were the broken windows. That broken windows was a metaphor for people. So that in order to maintain a sense of order or safety, that what was necessary was to rid the streets of what was deemed undesirable or who was deemed undesirable. So whether that's people who are homeless, whether that's LGBT, queer, trans and gender nonconforming, youth of color, et cetera, it's groups of people that were considered undesirable and disorderly just by nature of who we are. And so in many ways, that sets up what the period of policing has been like in New York City, but I don't want to make it sound like bad policing, abusive policing, discriminatory policing only started in the 90s, right? We know that there's actually been centuries of this. But the reason I think for this conversation, a broken windows understanding is important is because it really sets up how communities as a whole get criminalized. What broken windows policing relies upon and perpetuates is popularizing notions of who is a criminal, who is dangerous, simply by being able to typecast them as disorderly. And this is actually incredibly dangerous because we're not talking about violence. We're talking about order or disorder. And so when we're not actually talking about threats to our safety, we're talking about whether really people who have power, systemic power in New York City or around the country, believe that their order is threatened. And that's actually very dangerous if we buy into it. And unfortunately, too many of us have bought into it. So I'm gonna stop there. We can take, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but I wanna move the conversation because hearing from the other panelists, I think we'll start to draw a picture of what this web of criminalization looks like. So I'm gonna start first with Chaumtoli Huck, who is, I'm not actually gonna read anybody's bio because it's in your packets, but I do wanna say that Chaumtoli's been a long-term organizer in New York City and also a global feminist activist, and I'm really thrilled to have her talk about and help break down for us what this thing called the War on Terror is, some of the origins and what it means right now and what the implications have been for women, girls of color, as well as trans and gender nonconforming people.
So first of all, I am just like, this has just been a phenomenal moving, the panel before on girls, as a girl growing up in the Bronx, Black feminist scholarship saved me. You know, as a Muslim Bangladeshi woman, girl, Angela Davis was the first book that I read, and I was like, finally, someone got me. So I just want to kind of pay homage, and I think Andrea, to create the space and the tradition of Black women who have been doing it for all of us. So I just want to just take a moment to just really honor that and appreciate that. So I speak from that space of just being honored to be here. So I just want to thank to everyone. So War on Terror. So what I thought I would do, and I really want to be in conversation with our fellow activists and also each other, is maybe just give some framing ideas, and then we can sort of maybe go into the part where I feel like is most important, is what do we do about it? I think all of you in the room, what I'm going to say is not going to be anything surprising or it's going to resonate, right? We all sort of have the analysis based on our lived experience. So just to help for the conversation, I'm just going to kind of, what I thought about, so War on Terror sort of as a terminology emerged post 9/11. But I think I want to also, just the way that Joo-Hyun has done, is that policing and broken windows didn't emerge out of nowhere, right? It's part of a history of policing. So War on Terror, which is this policy of, foreign policy of militarization, war abroad, in all the countries which you have to see, not surprisingly, is on the Muslim and travel ban, right? So there are connections. Is this sort of aggressive action, and it underpins a couple of ideas, but make no mistake, the War on Terror ideology and rhetoric is very much embedded in colonialism and the idea that it's the United States or the Western countries that are on this sort of civilizing mission. And so the United States and other countries are going to go to countries that are Muslim majority, and they're going to civilize those countries because they are barbaric, right? Remember the axis of evil. You're either with us or against us, right? The sort of polarity. But where does gender come in? Gender comes in integrally to the War on Terror, because part of the civilizing mission, right, is that the Muslim women need to be saved, right? Because they are oppressed and they are exploited under Islam, under these regimes that are patriarchal. And so therefore the war and the violence and the disruption and the complete, the collateral damage, which involves children, girls dying, right, is part of this civilizing mission, right? So this is the rhetoric that underpins the War on Terror. And so what I wanted to do is kind of bring that down to how it shows up in two cases that maybe some of us may have forgotten. And I wanted to kind of bring these two girls back into our focus, into our minds. Around 2005, 2006, two girls, one Bangladeshi girl, Tasnuba Haider, and another girl, Adama Ba from Guinea-Bissau, two Muslim girls were arrested and thought to be suicide bombers. So on one hand, you have the War on Terror saying we need to protect, we need to save the Muslim women who are oppressed, right? And on the other hand, the flip side, and this should sound familiar in the construction even of black girls and black women, right? You're on this sort of duality. So on the other hand, the Muslim woman is the suicide bomber. She's dangerous. The 16-year-old girls, right, who are, and there was a lot of literature around that. There's a whole, actually just like a whole industry that's been kind of created around promoting and fueling Islamophobia and the war on terror. And during that, around that same time, the concern was that, it wasn't going to be the taxi drivers that were going to bring in all their, terrorist bombs and their yellow cabs, right? That's back to Giuliani. I'm just stating myself, right? But it's also going to be, now, it's going to be these young girls, Muslim girls, who are attracted by, who are radicalized, and they're going to become suicide bombers, which is like, again, sort of fueling this idea. So Tashnuba and Adama both were arrested, but there was no sort of criminal charges, but they were criminalized. They were both undocumented, and so essentially were caught up, and I'm not gonna, you're gonna hear about sort of the immigration sort of web, and so you can see how the terrorist charge, the war on terror, sort of weaves into our sort of anti-immigrant sort of policies. So Tasnuba, also family, was undocumented, out of status, and she was then deported back to Bangladesh. Adama, there was a recent story that was done about her, and so she remained because there was a lot of organizing that was done in her support, and she sort of had to get jobs, drop out of school, right? And the painful part, and this is the stuff that I hope that we get to, is how do we hold space for each other when we don't always support each other? So in Adama's case, she talks about being shunned by the Muslim community, by the broader activist community, because people were afraid, because she was a suicide bomber, she was a terrorist, so that it was easy to sort of move away from her. So when we think about, we sort of fast forward and we think about how is it that African countries come in, Somalia, Sudan, come into the Muslim and the travel ban. The origins of that have always been there, right? And I can go back and back and back. So in terms of looking at war and terror and also around white supremacy, they're also very much interlinked, right? So you have a Bangladeshi girl and you have an African immigrant, right? Both in 2005, way before Trump, way before any of the things that we're talking about, as being criminalized, as girls, as being dangerous. So how are they then going to get any access of rights? So I want to move on, and then we'll come back to it, but another story, most recent, Tashneen Malik, who was one of the San Bernardino shooters. When you look at the narrative around how she was presented, right? She is a woman who wore the full burqa. She radicalized her American US husband, right? And so this sort of dangerous burqa, hijab-wearing Muslim woman is then counters the hijabi woman who's in the Muslim majority countries who need saving, but in the United States, they're dangerous, right? So we want to go over there in our war and terror foreign policy, drone strikes, collateral damage, bomb the hell, save them. But when Muslim women are red, and when I talk about Muslim women, it's a diverse, I'm using it in all of its sort of, in its all way, then she becomes dangerous, right? If you Google even just like the crazy fetishization of like Muslim women, what they're carrying under their burqa, like they have like, there's some really phenomenal artists that really try to disrupt those of like the ammunition underneath her vagina. Like the idea of this like sexualized, dangerous Muslim woman is the image that's created through the war on terror. So I just want to end, and we probably come back to this, just to kind of set how this all sort of intersects. So we talked, in terms of racism, around immigration, around violence abroad. And then lastly, in terms of LGBTQ issues and how, again, we really need to figure out how do we put forth a solidarity and work that doesn't reinforce the sort of issues that we're fighting against. So the war on terror, you have a lot of liberal human rights sort of LGBTQ groups, majority, not surprising, elite, white, male-dominated, seeing that, these Islamic countries are majority homophobic, and therefore we have to save them, right? So again, this sort of saving, civilizing mission is being used again to reinforce ideas of homophobia. Is there homophobia in society? Yes, there's homophobia and violence here. But when we attach that with our struggles around equality to the war on terror, what we do is we reinforce all of these underlying sort of ideas around who needs to be civilized, who is criminalized, who needs to be contained, and who needs to sort of be criminalized. So I can talk more about that in terms of what does it mean for us in terms of building a movement that really is truly intersectional, not theoretically, but on the ground. And then just in terms of my own personal experience in 2014, coming out of a Gaza rally with my family being violently arrested. And in that moment, and doing sort of, self-advocacy around that, and just kind of the challenges that I experienced. One is people not wanting to get as close to the case, because I had gone to support Gaza and Palestine as a Muslim woman. And so even though this was a case of clear police brutality, there was a lot of reluctance from the activist community to actually come forward and support. And I get it, right? I get it because it's hard. Because why? Because then you have to get onto the sticky issue of Palestine, and we don't want to get into that, and that complicates, because we really want to talk more narrowly about police brutality. So again, they're all interrelated, and I think we need to sort of think through moving forward, how do we forge a politics that's really about solidarity and not necessarily kind of convenient. So I'll stop there, but I'm sure we'll have a lot more questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Chaumtoli. So similarly, we're going to hear from Mizue Aizeki, who's with the Immigrant Defense Project, not only on immigration enforcement in this country and how that's part of the web, but also really what I think we would call a war on immigrants and what the context is right now. Mizue?
Thank you so much. There's so much to say. I don't know where to start or where to end. But I think since someone said capitalism, we'll start there. And then someone said colonialism, and we'll also start there. But, I think part of what we are challenged with at this political moment, just like any political moment we're challenged with, is both, what has changed and what has stayed the same. And I agree, with Joo-Hyun, things have accelerated over the past 20 years for immigrants, especially at this intersection that we're here talking about, criminalization, war on drugs, war on terror. And this has defined much of our political work of people of my generation, in the sense that we have moved from not only being the most massive carceral state of people domestically, but also now the world's largest immigration, prison, and deportation system in the world. And this doesn't just happen based on, there's all these things are converging. It's ideology, right? It's financial support, and it's just a widespread acceptance, kind of, as Joo-Hyun pointed out, that we don't, as a society, those in power, have decided we don't need to build up, for the social well-being, a true security as we would imagine it, but into a national security, which is very much based on exclusion and punishment. And so, kind of back to the colonial piece of it, obviously the nation state is a project and a product of colonialism, and, very much the idea of exclusion, like belonging, rests on exclusion, right? And whether it's through exclusion through genocide or through forced labor or, enslavement, and forced movement or restricted movement and forced imprisonment, all those things. And so I imagine all of you guys understand this, but I think part of when we think of a moment in time, we tend to, we're trying to trace back, if we're gonna fight this moment, like what are the roots of it, right? And so we're challenged with both the roots of the very construction of the nation state, but also I think the capitalism question becomes very important. We're at a specific political moment, right? This idea of neoliberalism, an idea of, a lot of resources going towards militarization and policing and locking people up really became a dominant idea. And the reason why, we say all this stuff which may feel slightly obvious to us is because, it's always important, I think, to challenge ourselves as what becomes like a natural feeling to us, right? Is it natural to lock someone up because they shot somebody? Well, why? Like, who decided that, right? Or then you're taking it down the line. What if it's because someone possessed drugs, right? Or what if it's, because someone crossed the border without authorization from the state. And I think that, that's, in terms of those of us fighting every day to challenge these systems, it's like part of the challenge of right now, I feel like it's so many things have become naturalized, right? Both from the massive investment of the state in locking people up and keeping them down, and the whole military-industrial thing, to this idea that certain people, as Joo-Hyun said, embody criminality, right? And so, how do you start to challenge this idea that just because you are black or brown or of a certain class, you're gender nonconforming, all those things, that you are a human in so many different aspects, right? And that you are subject to laws, many of which unfair. You're subject to all forms of discriminatory policing and application of it. And I think, that's where it becomes extremely challenging, because the laws are so harsh, right? And the ability to fight once you're caught up in the system is so difficult. Right, so kind of bringing this back to policing and immigration, one of the things that really happened over the past 20 years, and particularly during the Obama administration, is the police became very much a pipeline for the detention deportation system, right? So now, at this point, anybody who's stopped by the police and they do a warrant check on you, your name is getting put into a database that's shared with the FBI, which is shared with DHS, right? You're getting fingerprinted, same thing, right? Do people know that if you get fingerprinted and you're held in police custody in many places, and not in New York City because we fought for this, right? But if we didn't fight for this, New York City would be turning over immigrants to ICE, right? Just at the request of ICE, not because they have to. And this happens all over the country. And I think the other piece of it, which is just another layer to this, is, when ICE talks about these so-called criminal aliens, right? This ranges from people who don't have status, to people who possess marijuana, to people who, have committed a murder but did their time and have been released, right? It's a whole range of people, but to the government, you're just one-dimensional, right? And so no matter what you've done, if you've done your time and how you rebuilt your life, that doesn't matter. And so I think the context in which we're facing is, in particular in New York City, is this idea of the intersections of all the things that you guys have heard about and talked about today and yesterday, I think, around policing, broken windows policing, and how that affects women and LGBTQ and all that. But I think the challenge we face is so all these systems, and we're going to talk about them today, converging and trying to figure out, when there's so much damage that's continually being done, and how rapid it is, how do we build sufficient power to counter it at this political moment? That's enough for me for now.
So, thanks, Mizue.
I know, it's like...
I'm probably going to come back to you, Mizue, to talk a little bit specifically around some of how the immigration system right now and immigration enforcement impact, in particular, women, girls, trans folks, as well as gender nonconforming folks. But first, I want to turn it over to Kassandra, Frederique from Drug Policy Alliance, who is, as far as I'm concerned, one of our civil rights leaders in the state. She is one of our... I'm looking forward to all of us learning from her right now. She, in her work around drug policy, connecting it with the intersections of racism, connecting it with the intersections of gender and classism, et cetera, really embodies how I think we should be thinking about human rights defense. So, Kassandra, if you could talk to give us some context around the war on drugs and what the context is, but also what it's meant for women and girls and gender nonconforming and trans folks of color.
Yeah, thanks. Hi. Drug Policy Alliance, we're a national organization working to end the war on drugs, and we have offices in New York, New Jersey, Colorado, New Mexico, and California. We have an office that does work in mostly Latin and Central America, and we've been around for 20 years, give or take, depending on what charter you look at. I think oftentimes when we talk about the war on drugs, there are different kinds of wars, even in the conversation about the war on drugs. So for me to even talk about how the drug war has impacted the criminalization web, it really, for me, has to go by which part of the conversation we want to focus on. So if we look at why drugs were made illegal in the first place, most people would think that they were made illegal because drugs are bad for you, right? That there's some science and that if you take one drug, you'll be addicted for the rest of your life, you can die, all these different issues. But what most people don't recognize is that the way that we've criminalized drugs has usually followed some sort of xenophobic, social control, miseducation propaganda that was associated with substances and groups of people. So if we even look at why the first drug laws were created, it would be Chinese migrants in San Francisco, right? And I always start talks with that point because oftentimes when we're talking about human rights violations, criminal justice, policing, folks tend to erase the criminalization that has happened to Asian folks a lot, right? So even in the way that we think about who has been criminalized, we have to take a historical arc. And so the first drug laws were actually written for Asian folks. If you look at marijuana and why that was made illegal, it was because of Mexicans. If you look at why cocaine was made illegal, it was for black folks, free black porters in the South, right? Because they had to stay awake to watch, to take in what was coming in on the ships, and cocaine keeps you awake. So when we talk about the war on drugs and why things were made illegal, we also have to talk about how white women were used as a vehicle for why to make drugs illegal, because people were scared that Chinese men would use opium and then try to rape white women, just like they thought using marijuana would have Mexicans rape white women, which made people think that if black men had cocaine, they would rape white women. So if we ever talk about the war on drugs and how we ever talk about the intersections, when I'm talking about where we're starting the conversation, there's not a conversation about women and drugs and women being a footnote. It's understanding that gender and women have always been part of the propaganda that has laid the conversation around how we create the way that we criminalize drugs in the first place. And so for us, I think part of the conversation even about the drug war is there are some people that want to end the war on drugs because they want to smoke marijuana. There are so many people invite me many places because they want to free the weed. And I'll say, I'll take your honorarium, but freeing marijuana. So the conversation about marijuana legalization is really interesting, right? Because people have put a lot of stock in the idea of freeing that plant. And they put that stock in it because they can easily point to the different ways that marijuana criminalization has harmed people. But oftentimes they talk specifically about the amount of people that get arrested, right? Mizue actually came to DPA and talked to us about how marijuana prohibition really impacts the immigration system, because what we learned from IDP was that marijuana is like the number 4 reason why people are deported or inadmissible, right? And so, but when people are talking about freeing marijuana, they're not talking about immigration, right? When people are talking about freeing marijuana, they're also not talking about dealing with the fact that when people are, when women or parents are talking to social workers about having a hard time with rearing their children, that even the mere mention of marijuana being a part of their routine can cause a child neglect case to be formed. So if there are people from the Bronx here, so if you go to the criminal court, the family court in the Bronx, you'll see scores of people, of parents coming through that are getting their children taken away because they were honest with their social worker who acts as their police officer in those cases. And I can say that very proudly as someone who was educated at the Columbia School of Social Work, to know that we are just as much as police officers, right? That the NASW is irresponsible in the way that it has not talked to their profession as to how we are a criminalizing force and agency. And so when we talk about the war on drugs, we're even talking about the hospital social workers, that when someone gives birth to their child, where people are illegally tested for drugs and you just gave birth and a social worker comes into your hospital room and tells you you can't take your kid home, right? But we're not talking about white women, right? The white women that we were supposed to protect, which is why we made all the drugs illegal in the first place, because those women are not in hospitals that get tested. But when you look at the research that shows if you are going to test at the same rate, it's most likely that white women will test positive for drugs. We're not talking about them because we're consistently going to continue to criminalize women of color for their possession or use or sale of drugs. But also when we talk about the war on drugs, we're also talking about the war on recreation, because there's this idea that not everyone is supposed to have joy or any kind of fun. But when we talk about that, when I talk about the war of recreation, when it comes to drugs, we're only okay with talking about recreational users that are men. We're never talking about recreational users that are women, trans, or gender nonconforming, because those people should not ever have fun. There's no reason for them ever to recreate because we cannot afford to. So even when you think about people that are functional, people that use drugs, you're not thinking of a woman. You're not thinking of a trans person, and you're not thinking of a gender nonconforming person. Oftentimes, the idea of a functional user, even when you think about people that drink alcohol, think about when you watch movies and people come home from work and they pour that scotch that's always in their living room, right? I've never seen them refill that glass thing. It's just always empty. It's always full.
That's right.
It's usually a man, and I know that because I watch so many years of soap operas, and I watch General Hospital, and Sonny Corinthos always has scotch just ready to pour, but Carly never had it. Or the only time Carly went to get the scotch was when she was very upset, because that's the only time that you have the generalized conversation of women using drugs. And so I think when we have a conversation about criminalization, we also have to recognize that in this year of the Trump apocalypse, right, they are using drugs as a reason to ramp up the war on terror.
Yeah.
That's right.
And as a reason to ramp up the deportation machine. Because even when you think about something like fentanyl, which is a more powerful opioid, right? They're talking about the places that they come from. They're coming from China. It's coming from Mexico. It's never coming from the US, right? It's always coming from somewhere else. And we have to, one, get the terrorists that are souping up our kids with heroin and opioids, and we have to deport all of them. Because there's no necessity or idea that the demand for drugs is American, right? That we will actually take our overusing of drugs as a reason to dictate what happens everywhere else. Because even if we talk about pain management, even though we're a small population of the world, we use most of the opioids. And now because we have a problem, we want to further eliminate the usage of opioids for pain management in other countries that they don't even have access to it. I think I'm gonna stop there.
So, thank you, Cassandra. We're going to move from some of the analysis around the war on recreation and talk a little bit, I think, about now that we've got some context on the war on terror, the war on immigrants, the war on drugs, how they intersect with policing as well as criminalizing overall. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to say a few words in terms of what's our opportunities in the current landscape to shift this, especially in terms of reducing the harm that's happening for women, girls, trans folks, and gender nonconforming folks. So any of you want to start, or we can just go down the line? Let's go down the line.
Opportunities.
Chaumtoli.
Well, I think there are opportunities because as, all of these things are now converging. Like we're seeing it now in a way maybe, I can speak for myself and just in terms of over the years of organizing and also as a lawyer seeing all these laws, right? In 2006, when the sort of immigration laws were passed that created the category of criminal alien. Same time was a Democratic President Clinton creating the war on poverty, right? In terms of taking away public benefits that you were mentioning. So sort of the concept of personal responsibility, amping up sort of the I'm of the, this is your brain on drugs, Nancy Reagan, just say no, right? So all of that at that time existed. It's just that we were in it, so we were not able to really see kind of how those systems sort of played out over time. And so I think now the opportunities is that really that we're able to see this web of immigration, war on terror, immigration issues, and drugs, and how they're all literally colliding. And it's coming up in the particular administration, but again, like I mentioned before and others, that it's been there. So the opportunity, I think, for us is, my father used to say that seeing connections is a burden, but it's also a blessing. A burden because sometimes you gotta be everywhere, and feel like you have to be in every different struggles. But I think also it's an opportunity because we see that they're interconnected, we can bring that framing back to our local organizing work, right? Like, you don't need to be in all of, like, I feel like war on drugs, drug policy, Kassandra got it, like, she good, right? So we can then take this framing back into our organizing work and infuse it to make these connections. So I think that making those connections, to me, is really the opportunity, and then to think about the harder work of the strategy, right? So for example, I didn't have a chance to talk about broken windows and immigration war and terror, even though New York City is a sanctuary city, but broken windows policy, if it continues to exist, right, brings people, young people particularly, into the criminal justice system, and it has a disproportionate impact on Black and Latino immigrants, who then, when you look at statistics done by the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, BAJI has done phenomenal work on looking at the disproportionate impact around Black immigrants in this deportation machine, right? So we need to sort of then begin to see how white supremacy and local policy, so I'm not of the illusion that New York City is a sanctuary city. Because when I mentioned to you about my own particular case, coming out of a Gaza rally, I was standing on the street waiting for my family. And it's at that moment that an officer told me to move, right? And I did, but that wasn't enough. And so he shoved me, pushed me against the wall, and the visuals that later on that I found was that his entire pelvis was on my body. Right, so we're talking about also sort of sexual violence and how does and it was mentioned earlier, right? So in that moment, I felt like in my own particular case, fighting against sort of the really war crimes in Gaza in 2014, right? Coming out and being, what is broken windows? The idea that if I'm hanging around loitering, that I'm gonna be engaged in like worse crimes. Being bodied as sort of wearing traditional sort of ethnic garb, right, made me sort of a target, right? And then the sexual violence. So for me, the opportunity is to just see how they're connected and not just see this simply as, oh, this is a police misconduct case. And which was said to me is like, oh, well, at least you didn't die, right? Like, so I guess it was a sexually assaulted, and that was like, so just I think as we begin to sort of change the way that we talk about how these issues come together and in each person's life, like I think it's an opportunity for us to come back locally, come back to the ground, and to really support grassroots organizing, which to me is really the only way to go. I say that like until I'm blue in the face, like until we organize across our issue areas, we're not gonna be able to sort of fight back against this, this web.
Thanks, Chaumtoli. Before we move on to Mizue and Kassandra, I just want to take a moment to follow up on a point that Chaumtoli just made, which was, well, a few things. One is that this idea of police abuse only being about when people are killed and murdered by law enforcement. One of the things that many of us in New York learned from an activist longtime activist, Richie Perez, who passed away in 2003, He was a co-founder of the Young Lords Party, also founded the National Congress of Puerto Rican Rights, which today operates as the Justice Committee. But one of the things he really taught us in the 90s was to understand that the most egregious police killings, and there were a lot of egregious police killings in New York City in the 90s, so whether it's Amadou Diallo, who was killed in a hail of 41 bullets, whether or not it was Yongxin Huang, who was 16, just playing with his friend, who was killed, whether it was Anthony Baez, who was choked to death by a cop 20 years before Eric Garner was choked to death by a cop. All of these cases are really the tip of the iceberg, and that what they actually exhibit for us is that there's daily dehumanization, daily abuse, daily violence that is happening to people under the radar, at least for the media and for non-affected communities. There's really daily violence that happens, and that unless we address the daily humiliations that people are facing at the hands of law enforcement, we can't actually prevent the extreme deaths that end up happening. And so that has always stuck with me in some ways, because it really talks about how, I think speaks to how we need to look at what and organize around the daily violence. And so there's two examples I actually want to just bring into the room right now. One is one of the first police brutality cases I worked on, which was and it's actually, I think, cited in Andrea's book. I think you told me that, I don't remember. But there was, in 1998, a trans woman of color named Jalea Lamott was at home. Her mother calls 911 because she was concerned about Jalea. Cops come as first responders, which I hope all of us in this room, if we don't understand yet, soon come to understand that cops should never, ever, ever be first responders in cases where there's emotional and mental distress, or in many other cases for that matter. But cops come. Jalea's fine by then, actually. Jalea's up and walking. And the cops come and they flirt with Jalea. They go into the apartment. They find out from Jalea's mom that Jalea's fine. And then they realized that they thought that Jalea's mother misgendered her in the call to 911. So they thought that they were responding to a call for somebody's son. And they became enraged, in a transphobic rage, beat Jalea, beat the mother, beat Jalea's brother, neighbor who was in the house, beat the dog. Jalea, her family, her neighbor had to fight criminal charges against them, false, trumped-up criminal charges, including resisting arrest, obstruction of justice, governmental administration, other things, simply because they were just going about their day, and the cops were called, and the cops had this transphobic response. Now, at the time, I was with a group called the Audre Lorde Project. How many of you know Audre Lorde Project? Yes. I see their past CD is in the room over there, Kara Page. But the ALP was working with one of the largest gay organizations in New York City at the time. First contacted them about the case to say, hey, we should work on this together. And then we had to stop working with them. And the reason was because they said that this was really a gay case. Sometimes they said it was a trans case, but they basically said it was a gay or a trans case. And for us, what was clear was that this wasn't only transphobia. This was in public housing. There's no way this happens in the Upper East Side in the way it happened. This was about race. This was about gender. All of those interlock for why this family is facing charges after trying to defend one of their family members, Jalea, from a transphobic police attack. And so I'm bringing that up in part because since that time, I think one of the things that has happened is that there's a much more growing acknowledgement in New York City's anti-police brutality movement, at least, of the need to really integrate an understanding around homophobia and transphobia and misogyny. The second example I want to bring is like very current. So how many of you have heard of this 18-year-old young woman who was raped by two Brooklyn detectives?
Yes.
Many of you have, some of you haven't. For those who haven't, September 15th, an 18-year-old was in a car with friends. That car was stopped by two Brooklyn detectives. These two Brooklyn detectives stopped the car, claimed that they suspected that she had drugs in her bra, made her lift her shirt to prove that that wasn't so, then searched the car and found maybe a little bit of weed in a cup or something, and some anti-anxiety medication. basically told her to get out of the car, that they were going to bring her to the precinct, instructed the friends not to follow them, and brought her in the back of their truck to a parking lot and raped her. They then released her. They never arrested her. They told her not to say anything to anyone. Thankfully, she did, but currently, those cops are still in the force, and what they told their supervisors when this came to light was that that sex was consensual. Now, they had her handcuffed, in custody. Even if she wasn't handcuffed, she was in police custody. None of us have power when there are armed men who are law enforcement who have us in their custody. And so the idea that this is even entertained as potentially consensual, I think really speaks to what this moment is. And those are the daily abuses. And what I would actually suggest is that those two detectives, there's no way this is the first time they sexually abused somebody. No way. And there is no way that nobody in their precinct knew about them. And so there's an entire blue wall of silence, but there's also a web of law enforcement protecting each other, especially around sexual violence, racial violence, transphobic violence, et cetera. And so I'm going to stop there and go back to this question about opportunities and where we're at on Mizue. Tell us about immigration enforcement.
Opportunities.
Good cases.
Sorry?
The good, positive cases.
Well, I think, what do I want to say? I appreciate being on the panel with people who've been doing this work for a long time, because I feel like, one of the things that we know is, regardless of the political context we are in, it's always been worse in a certain way, and there's always been possibilities in those moments. And, I think that is what gives me hope and opportunity in this moment, is to share space with you all who are people still committed, obviously, to these issues, able to talk fluidly about gender violence and police violence and all the different forms that takes, from, what the daily abuses to, taking people's lives. And I think that to me, in the past 10 years, I think the kind of growing and let me step back. I think the continual opposition to those forms of state violence, but I feel like a sharpening of it, honestly, over the past 10 years with Black Lives Matter, and I think, the emergence of organizations like you mentioned, like BAJI, Black Alliance for Just Immigration, just kind of helping us sharpen these issues, kind of how they are organized, or oppression is organized around race, class, gender, nationality, and all that stuff. So that's the opportunity. What do we do with ideas? We have to build power. But I think, part of the notion and kind of recognizing the violence of broken windows policing is a conversation that's happening more and more, right? I think, for those of you around in the Giuliani time when it was starting to emerge, I think the idea that this would become something that people would be able to articulate the links between gentrification and capitalism and class and race and policing, I don't know, maybe it's changed, right? So, and I think so kind of going back to building power around that, at the Immigrant Defense Project, our mission is to fight for the rights of all immigrants, so in particular immigrants with criminal histories, people who get arrested, people who are criminalized because they actually have criminal convictions. And I think that, in the era of Obama, where he really, people are familiar with his felons, not families phrase, what he did, which was different than Bush, was kind of move the focus from immigrants crossing the border without authorization, the wall, to immigrants who had criminal convictions, and kind of really you thinking of police as a force multiplier for immigration policing. And I think that, what one of our struggles was in the previous is constantly this idea of who's a good immigrant, who's a bad immigrant, right? And I think on the gender frame, it was always kind of the women who were worthy of saving could only be victims, right? So if you had someone who was a survivor of violence, but they happened to have a drug felony conviction, all of a sudden, no one was willing to step up and protect them. And I think, part of what happened in that whole process was both kind of, to this point of what Joo-Hyun was saying, really the anti-violence community coming together and saying police are not, should not be the first responders. There have to be agency for women in violent situations, or anyone in a violent situation, to try to figure out their own pathway out of that violence. And I think part of our work on this collusion between ICE and police has really shown that for many communities, the police can't be that, right? Because it's a pipeline into deportation. And so I think part of what I'm trying to construct in my positives, I think in this moment where everyone's under attack, right? Where I think everyone's becoming criminalized as an immigrant, it's really forcing people to kind of hone in to say, you know, what benefit do I have from parsing it out and saying, well, actually, I'm a good immigrant and that's a bad immigrant. And I think in the recent case study, you'll see, do people know about the DREAM Act that's in front of the Congress, right? Yeah. So, you know, a lot of the people who fought for that are saying, like, we're not, I guess they're calling it the clean dream, right? We're not going to trade off our parents and our friends who don't qualify under your, you know, so-called good immigrant frame and throw them under the bus. And so I think that that's definitely a result of like a lot of organizing that happened, but also kind of a real recognition in this political moment that, you know, we have to fight for everyone.
Thanks, Mizue. And Kassandra.
You know, I realize that we're being taped, so I've been like really struggling if I'm gonna say it. But so when it comes to the drug war, where I see opportunity, white people are dying in large numbers. So much so that the life expectancy for a white man has gone down. That means a lot of people have died. And there are a lot of reasons for it, but one of them is drugs and alcohol. And I think there was a panelist before, Octavia, talked about the reframing of the drug war because white folks are dying, right? So this current moment that we're in around heroin and opioids, where the face of the drug crisis is white people, there is a noticeable shift in the kind of structural response to what is happening, right? So people are hearing more words like compassion. You're hearing law enforcement saying things, we can't arrest our way out of this problem. And that is true. And I also want to hold that criminalization is still happening, right? Like that we haven't thrown the whole thing out, that they are creating new ways to criminalize same communities. So looking at things like drug-induced homicide bills, which is if I sell drugs to Mizue and Mizue dies, they can charge me with manslaughter. So trying to figure out different ways to continue the criminalization machine. But I will say, going back to white death and going back to the white face of the opioid crisis, there is opportunity. And that sounds very crude, but it's very true. Because when you have law enforcement trying to reshift their narrative around who they are and trying to, police officers are now begging to be some sort of social worker or case manager, connecting people to resources in order to stave off lost potential. And I think that in this moment, we have to do something very different. Which is not do the delineation that we have done in the past, where other movements have done, like good immigrant, bad immigrant, good gay person, bad gay person, right? Like good black person, bad black person, good drug user, bad drug user, right? So the good drug user is the one that's like struggling with addiction and really hard on their luck, and they didn't mean to do that. In this moment, it's called the accidental addict, right? Versus, and when someone is an accidental addict in this moment, that means everyone that died 30, 40 years ago was on purpose, right? That they didn't fall into crack, right? Like people are falling into heroin vats, but they didn't know that it was heroin, and there's this narrative right here is for me an opportunity. And the opportunity is we have to reframe the way we organize. Yes. Because the way that we've done it before has been based on political viability. Yes. What was most likely to pass? What was most likely to get the most people? And honestly, when it comes, we have to think about in our movements, what is the issue that if we get it done, most people will leave our movement? So for my movement, it's marijuana. Once marijuana gets legalized, so many people are gonna leave the conversation of the drug war because they got what they wanted. For most people, for some people, the heroin issue is their issue. Once you get access to treatment, and not everyone get access to treatment, but that one person getting access to treatment gets it, they might leave the whole movement. So for me, the opportunity is how many more connections can we create within our organizing structure and as a part of our political analysis? How can we use this moment of white death and loss as a way to figure out how we can center Black trans women in drug policy? Right. So when we're having conversations about supervised injection facilities, which are medical facilities where people can come and use pre-obtained drugs under the medical supervision, right? How do we connect that conversation to trans women that are getting street hormones on the street and have no place to inject and don't have access to primary care and aren't actually created to linkages? How can we create a place where if we're fighting, and you're seeing this in places like Seattle, San Francisco, Boston, Ithaca, New York City, Philadelphia, everyone is having conversations about supervised injection facilities. People are taking risks to run underground supervised injection facilities to stop the dying. But we can't just stop the dying for people that inject drugs. We have to stop the dying for Black trans women. We have to stop the dying for black people that are giving birth. We have to stop the dying for immigrants. We have to stop the dying for the Muslims that are under surveillance. And so how do we create a praxis organizing strategy that actually unroots a lot of the stereotypes that impede us from doing cross-sectorial organizing? And I think that we can use this moment for white death as the structures are changing for our organizing models to change, to not just be responsive to what they're shifting, but for us to be responsive to our imagination of what liberation is supposed to look like.
So I think we have about 10 minutes, is that right? Yeah, I think we got about 10 minutes left. We want to open it up to folks in the audience, in particular, to hear about strategies that you're using or that you think should get used in order to really disrupt some of this web of criminalization that we've been talking about.
Veterans have a veterans treatment court that allows them to be moved away from the criminal system. So criminally involved veterans that haven't committed a violent offense, that's like a big part of it, instead of going to jail, they end up going to a veterans treatment court where they're paired with a fellow mentor. There we go. And they're given a rigorous program where like they have so many times to default before they're kicked out of the program, and then they go to jail. But it's an opportunity that I think can be used for mental health cases in general. And other special groups, veterans didn't become a protected group in New York City until this summer. So this veteran treatment court model has been used before the law was even in place, and I think that's an opportunity for other groups. So if we're seeing youth, especially if you're 16, why are you in a maximum facility prison? That aside, there should be some kind of youth treatment court. But I also have a question for you. I think that's one opportunity we could use, but I also have a question. When we talk about who needs to be contained in terms of terrorism, how do we contend with, one, different definitions of terrorism, even at the federal level, let alone the state level? And then the fact that most definitions include a politically motivated attack, but doesn't specify what kind of politics, because a bunch of people can hold up a federal building in Ohio and not be deemed terrorists, but the guy that shot up LA 2 weeks ago or a few weeks ago, also not a terrorist. Last week, a guy ran into several people, like right here, managed to be taken into police custody alive, holding 2 guns that, yes, we found out they were fake, but they didn't know that then. But other people, like that, the word terrorism has really been used for Black and brown bodies. Like, we don't hear the word terror until that happens. So how do we contend with who needs to be contained when we have all of these obstacles in the way?
So because of that reason, I actually shy away from using that word terrorism, although rhetorically I do think as an organizing sort of strategy, it has some sort of way to, to talk about sort of just long-standing historical terrorism and brutal violence of KKK or Bannon now, right? So like talking about you're more likely, the Southern Poverty Law Center found that you're more likely to be, a victim of white supremacist violence than Islamic violence, right? So I don't use that term partly because I think it gets into another question about tactics and strategies for movements, right? Because when we begin to sort of make equal any kind of use of violence for a political motive, then how do we understand revolution, right? So for example, Bangladesh became independent and then South Asia through armed revolution, right? So let me not be mistaken because it is recorded, right? So a Muslim person talking about armed revolution, but what I'm saying is that when we use this word terrorism, it's not defined, but I think just politically, because I really want to kind of lift up that we do need to think about what's the undergird of some of these concepts. So I'm reluctant, and I want to be in conversation, I want to hear, to label things, that's a terrorist and this is a real terrorist, that this is violence that has either a purpose that's liberatory or a purpose that is to still terror, right? And so there's some good writings about that. So for me, very narrowly, I think I see how it can be a rhetorical tool to sort of call out the white supremacist violence as that's terrorism, that's not terrorism. But at the same time, I would caution us because any kind of political movement has most movements have had an aspect of using violence to achieve a political goal. And I know it makes us uncomfortable, but that is something we have to. And so I refuse to go into that because it's the way in which movements, for example, Black Power movement, the organizing of Black Muslims that was the logic, right, that allowed for surveillance of Black Muslims in the 60s. So this surveillance, NYPD, is not something has occurred on bodies of Black bodies, right? So, and decimated those movements, right, because of this terrorism. It's actually re-emerging in this term, and I don't know if you've heard it, Black identity extremism, right? So I think we just have to, I'm not answering your question, and to say that I think we should tread with those words lightly because what are we, instead of just naming it, and sort of that would be sort of my response, because respond to the violence of the state. So for me, we need to reorient ourselves towards that rather than naming which behavior, because it goes back to good and bad. Because if they're terrorists, then therefore they are to be subjected to deportation, Guantanamo, and also supermax prison. Like, what is the purpose of us doing this labeling? Like, unless I understand kind of what's the underlying purpose of that, then I think we can the definition sort of makes sense. But definition for me oftentimes leads to this othering, and which I'm a little bit cautious of. I just want to take this last minute to just say, I may have misspoken in terms of the opportunity. I think I want to be clear that grassroots impacted communities have known everything that we've saying for a long time. So my thing about is, for example, the queer movement has been a trans movement since the 60s, right? It's not like a new thing, it's just that we've co-opted some of these movements. I want to give a shout out to Drum, who's going to speak later. Roxana Moon talks about transformational solidarity versus transactional. They've been doing Muslim registry work in 2000. I think we just need to pay attention to those who are doing grassroots organizing led by impacted people. And those of us who are not identified as such should really listen to those communities and take leadership on those policies. So every single issue, I can give you an example of someone who's done work like years back, like I'm sorry to break it to you, we're not done anything new. It's just that they've been ignored. And so I think we just need to really lift up their stories a lot more. So I just wanted to mention that.
And I just want to say something, Mizue is going to say something too, about the problem courts. So there are like veteran courts, mental health courts, immigration courts, drug courts. To me, I think those are cop-outs, because I think it is a tacit admission that people don't need to go to jail. So it's like, if you're saying we're not going to put people in jail and we're going to give them access to services, then why don't you just give people access to services, right? So like, there's no point in like creating a new structure unless the main point of it is, I'm going to give you these services while you're still under surveillance. And so when you look at things like, so you're talking about veteran courts, I'm talking about drug courts that do not work, don't have the evidence, and Donald Trump in this moment when people are dying left and right decides that what he wants to do, instead of giving people access to methadone and buprenorphine, which are consistently researched to show to cut mortality in half, he would rather create the infrastructure for a mass surveillance system around people that use drugs that is called drug courts, that is not going to stop any dying and is going to continue to reinforce social workers being law enforcement.
Thank you. So I think we're actually, unfortunately, at time, but I know Mizue, were you going to say one last thing?
Cassandra wanted me to say this one thing. Just from the immigration side, too, on the problem courts, for immigration, even if you go through a problem court system, if you ever admitted to doing the thing, they're going to regard that as a conviction, right? So the system will never let you go, and so that's just the wrap up on.
Thank you, Mizue. Two things before we close out, and I'm going to ask. One is, this may seem like it's unrelated, but I actually think it's pretty related. So we're talking about criminalizing webs and just the whole web of criminalization. But the other piece of that is, how do we take care of our communities? And how do we build not only self-defense, but really fullness within our communities, be able to actually ensure that all of our communities can experience joy and safety in ways that are nourishing and can help us grow to all of our full potential. So one thing that, how many of you were here last night? You heard Barbara Smith? Mm-hmm. So I wanted to make one plug, which is that, so Barbara Smith, legendary Black lesbian feminist activist who was one of the founders of the Combahee River Collective, was a publisher for a long time of the only woman of color press in the United States. There's some postcards over there because she is old enough to retire, is still working, and many things that she worked on did not, over the past several decades, like many of our freedom fighters in our communities, did not provide something like a pension or something that would provide as she gets older. And so for those of us, how many of you get a coffee at one of those shops like once or twice a week maybe? Some of you are going to admit it. How many of you maybe have a beverage or other kinds of substances a few times a month? How many of you have gone to a movie sometime recently? So what I'm going to ask you to do is to think about some of that, which is what I would call our disposable income, and think about whether or not you'd be willing to pledge some of that for a month or a year to Barbara's Caring Circle. There are postcards over there. There is a website, which is smithcaringcircle.com. It could be $5 a month, it could be $50 a month, or what have you. And the reason why I'm plugging this is that we have so many freedom fighters from our communities who are older now without family for various reasons, who can provide sustenance, or without inherited wealth, because that's not what our communities have. And there's not a social safety net in this country that's going to take care of them. So if we don't, no one will. So I want to make that plug for any folks who are able to consider even doing it as a one-time contribution if you can't do it ongoing. The last thing I want to say is really thank you to all of you. I know that the next panel later today, I think, is about resistance. We didn't get to some of that conversation in this. I fully trust it will happen in the next panel, but I want to give a round of applause to all the panelists. Thank you.